Prevention magazine now presents Haywood Hale Broun, that author, lecturer, and avid reader. Woody's guests have something special to offer the reader and the listener. Here now is Woody Broun.
Hello, this is Haywood Hale Broun. The guest today is Dr. Erich Fromm, and we are discussing his book, To Have or to Be. Now, this book is a distillation of a number of other books that Dr. Fromm has written. Very often I start out by saying, well, what he is trying to say is this, that, or the other. I won't take that liberty with you. I will ask you to say, in a few words, and then we'll try to expand on it, what is to have or to be about? What is the philosophy on which it starts?
Well, in the first place, it is not exactly a distillation. It is a new aspect which I'm investigating, which continues the investigation of other aspects of basic human qualities. What I do in this book is to study two modes of existence, namely one mode of existence which I call the mode of having, and one mode of existence which I call the mode of being. Now, of course, having and being in the ordinary use of the language seem to be nothing special. Everybody knows we must have something. And about the word being, well, there is a great philosophical literature on being. There's thousands and thousands of books are written about it from a philosophical standpoint. But nevertheless, there are quite a number of thinkers who have made a clear dichotomy between having and being. By having, they mean, and I mean, an attitude where one wants to have, and wants to have everything for oneself, and more and more of what one wants to have.
And one is then what one owns. I mean, there is that old saying, I think, therefore I am, and this it is, I have, therefore I am.
Quite right. That leads to the feeling which one can express, I am what I have. And therefore, if I have nothing, I am nothing. If I lose what I have lost myself. I end up in having nothing and being nothing.
Well, there is a splendid literary example of that. There is a short novel of Saki's called The Unbearable Bassington, in which the author says, if you were asked to describe Francesca Bassington, you would describe her drawing room, which is Francesca, and in which hangs the great painting by van der Meulen. Well, at the end of the book, her son dies. She has never really achieved a relationship with him, and she goes for consolation into the drawing room of her things, and there an expert tells her that the great van der Meulen is a fake. That this painting on which she had built her life is a fake, and so she is left, as you say, if you have nothing, you are nothing.
Yes, and the being orientation is much more difficult to describe because it is rare today. In our culture, the having orientation is predominant. Everybody wants to have something. His security is based on having things, on keeping them, of having more. And that creates a greed, because one can never have enough if one's being, or if one's identity is based on having, because one can lose what one has. So I have to have more and more to defend myself against the possibility of losing what I have. And yet one is always anxious, because all one has, one can lose, as in your example.
Well, I suppose that is also since so much of wisdom is contained in myth, the legend of Midas.
Exactly.
What he touches becomes money, and then it is
Exactly. That is really the classic myth of the having. One dies from having.
Now, there is a kind of having which you approve in your book, which you call existential having, which
Yes.
is having that much which is necessary for the maintenance of the simplicities of life.
Exactly. That is not a having, as you say, which is based on greed, but having what one needs to live. And therefore, one's sense of identity is not based on that having. It is rooted in human existence, and even a saint will have a certain minimum to live. But he would be he would be having in an existential sense, as an outgrowth of human existence, but not in a characterological sense, that his main impulse is to have more, and that if he loses something, he is lost. Today it's a peculiar thing, even if you observe language today. Today people use less and less verbs and use more and more nouns together with I have. Today a woman says, I have a happy marriage. I have much love for my husband. I have a problem. That is to say, all things are connected with me as attributes of having, instead of saying, as one still did 50 years ago, and I remember it, I am sad, I'm confused, instead of I have a problem. In fact,
I am happily married.
I'm happily married, I love my husband, instead of I have a happy marriage. And of course, to have a problem is nonsense. There is no problem one can have. On the contrary, the problem one has one.
Yes. Yeah.
One is possessed by a problem, but one doesn't have a problem. And the same, careful observers already in the 18th century, French writer de Marais saw this very clearly, how one says, for instance, I have an idea instead of I think. And we are so accustomed today that since the middle of the 18th century this has tremendously increased. In my own lifetime, I'm 76 now, I can remember how different one spoke 50 years ago from now, where everything is having and where one avoids verbs. For instance, take another example. Somebody says, I have insomnia, instead of I cannot sleep.
Or I do not have sleep.
Or I do not have sleep.
Well, now, an example that you gave early in the book from poetry was that Tennyson speaks of the plant which he has plucked from the cranny in the wall. That is, having the plant, he speculates about it, but whatever his speculation, the plant is now dead. He has it, and the Japanese poet who simply looks at the plant.
And in fact, we don't enjoy anything which we don't have. Enjoying something in the act of being, namely seeing, is not enjoyment. I would go a step further. We really don't believe we enjoy something if we haven't paid for it. That the greatest enjoyment in this life one doesn't have to pay for. One just sits on a bench and looks out.
Just the fascination with those expensive paintings by Rembrandt and others, where you can say, this is the $3 million painting.
Exactly, and people are impressed not because the painting is so beautiful, because it costs $3 million, or the salary, the way of an actor, of a newspaper man. They are what, or film star, they are what impresses people, not really what he does, because most people are not even accustomed to respond to what a person does. It has a dollar mark on it.
Well, now, years ago in his Nobel Prize speech, Bertrand Russell said that he thought the world's salvation lay in what he called enlightened self-interest. Now, that's a subjective phrase, because what is enlightened and what is self-interest? But he felt that acting within a system already existing, we could modify it. It is your belief, I gather, in To Have or To Be, that to modify it is not enough, that there must be a shift toward an entirely different way of looking at things.
Yes, that is perfectly true. One cannot, well, if I spoke theologically, one cannot modify the devil. It's a choice between the devil and, if you speak theologically, God, or between one aim or another aim. Of course, everyone is mixed. You might say there are people who almost are 100% live in the mode of having, and these are people who you might find perhaps already in an insane asylum. They are so obsessed by having, so completely taken up, that they have an amount of greed and incapacity to respond, that they are really very sick people. And you might say there are people who are almost 100% in the mode of being. They are what we call saints. If you take a description of Christ, then he is a person who wanted to have nothing, and for him having nothing, sharing what he has with the poor, sacrificing his life that he has out of love for his fellow man, that is an extreme state of being. And we admire these people, strangely enough, but we do not practice what we admire.
Well, we admire them, but is it not a sophisticated and perhaps incorrect view? For example, the saint, a simple religious brother with a begging bowl and a habit, is often accused of the sin of pride. In other words, that he is, his very humbleness is a kind of pose, a kind of sin.
Yes, that is perfectly true. In fact, in Catholic theology, there's a lot of wonderful things which are said about the psychology of the so-called very pious person. I think of a writer who is one of my favorite writers, Meister Eckhart, who in a beautiful way debunks all the people who think by doing good deeds and hoping thereby they acquire God's response. He calls them, they are all asses.
Mm-hmm.
And there is nothing religious in that. It's just a show. That is certainly true. And this is perhaps one of the interesting problems of religious psychology, where you have the genuine thing, a person who really gives and isn't aware of the fact that he does anything specifically. For him, the mode of being, of sharing, is that which satisfies him most, and it is the most pleasurable for him. While all for the person in the mode of having, this seems like something almost out of the world, which must be terribly difficult. It isn't really difficult if one has a different kind of orientation.
Well, as the listener can understand, we have simply at this moment dropped a Japanese paper flower into the water, and it's beginning to open, and there are going to be a great many more complications to discuss before we're through talking to Erich Fromm about his book, To Have or to Be. In the sense of being, it need not be, as you have said in the book, and as we were just discussing, a kind of tremendously ascetic life. It is simply a life which is based on experience rather than acquisition. Would that be a fair statement?
It's a perfectly fair statement. It's not ascetic at all. I could quote again Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was far from being ascetic. He enjoyed life in all its aspects, and he made it very clear. What matters is that every moment is enjoyed, and nothing is there to be collected and to be held back. A wonderful example, of course, is Goethe, who was one of the most outstanding examples for a man living almost exclusively in the mode of being. Only the Herr Geheimrat, the official personality in him. There one can say there were the remnants of his having orientation, but that was very little. And his work, Faust, the whole point he makes there is that as soon as I say to the moment, stay, that is to say, I want to possess you, in this moment Satan has won the bet, because in this moment man is lost. It has nothing to do with asceticism. On the contrary, the ascetics very often are only indirectly people who are greatly in the having mood. They want to collect good deeds. They think that if they have many good deeds, their religious life, their offerings, their prayers, their giving alms and whatnot, then they are really fulfilling God's will. Well, they are really only living in another form of having. Namely, they collect like miser might collect old objects or money. So they collect good deeds and hope for good that this is a good investment which will be paid after their death.
Well, now, as you point out in the book, the mode of having has not always been widespread. There have been societies which have existed pretty much in the mode of being without
Yes.
a strong sense of property, or certainly the American Indian wandered back and forth across this country, living in and off the country without any sense of this is my place or this is yours.
Exactly, exactly. And you might even say in the Middle Ages, from the 11th century to the 15th century, there was not this sense of having. There were only some people like the Fuggers, like the great
Bankers, yes.
bankers, who had this complex of having. But the average person, like today in many primitive tribes, is happy when he can sing and talk with others and do his work and have a cup of coffee and just feeling he's together with others and is part of humanity.
Well, I remember an account of a pygmy tribe in the Belgian Congo, which, when the group had killed an elephant, which means a great deal to eat for a great deal of time, they would sit in a circle around the elephant, each with a reed pipe which played a single note, and among them they create the song. I blow a note, you blow a note, the next fellow blows a note, and it finally becomes a melody of happiness around the elephant. You may say that they have it, but it is only something which they will consume as a tribal thing. It's an existential habit.
Exactly. For instance, jewelry. Among many primitive people among this Indian tribe, I think I know the report on the same tribe you were mentioning. Well, jewelry is enjoyed, but one is happy to give it to somebody else. While in our culture, we are anxious that this is our piece, that we have that, and that it cannot get lost, and also shouldn't be used by anybody else.
Therefore, it is not fair to say, as people defensively do, it is human nature to want to have things.
No, certainly not. This whole concept of human nature, I think one can say, has done great havoc. Every society imagines that what it is human nature. And that is a naive standpoint, like a man from a small town cannot imagine and finds it unnatural how people live in a big town. And it can be shown, actually, that this having orientation, if you take the whole of human history and prehistory, is an exception. For instance, the whole society before exploitation began, before one began to build cities, that is to say, the Neolithic society of primitive agriculture. Well, generally speaking, there were what people did. Women cultivated the earth, men hunted. The idea that one could exploit another person, make him work for oneself, was completely foreign. It was so foreign to them as that it is foreign to us that one could not exploit a person if one has a chance. And
well, I must say, let me just interrupt you for a moment because it's in line with what you're saying. Bertrand Russell, in that same speech I spoke of earlier, said that in a hunting society, everyone was busy all the time, and he rather thought that when agriculture was invented, the women did most of the work, the men sat at the door of the hut, invented philosophy, and our troubles began, because man then began to speculate on his role rather than simply by being.
Yeah, well, I think that has a great deal to do with a transition from a society in which the women were equal to the establishment of male hierarchy and dominance. As far as I can see from the literature, there was the society up to the third millennium, women were essentially equal, and if not in some matriarchal societies, superior. Exploitation of women, that men rule, goes together with the first exploitation of men in general. Rulership of man, that which begins when surplus begins, when men have the possibility of hiring people to do the work on the land, while they can use then that surplus and to build artificial things, artifacts, and cities and armies. Well, then the whole concept of having changes, or having becomes a dominant feature. For the primitive society, there was really nothing they wanted to have, but they wanted to be. They enjoyed being, they enjoyed the work they did, but they had no urge to collect it, to retain it, to have more. And this begins really with the establishment of man's predominance. That is to say, of patriarchal male society, in which the aim was to have power to make other people work for one. And the first one made to work were the women.
Well, now, the historian Herbert Muller suggested that as far as Western society is concerned, the villains are the Greeks, in the sense that they invented the concept of dualism, of man as separate from nature, and that nature existed for the service of man.
Yes. Now, that is a very interesting point. Actually, women have one quality which men don't have. That is to say, women can bear children. Men cannot. That a man is necessary to produce a child is only a scientific truth, but it is not anything which has reality and experience. He has very little to do with it. Women alone have the capacity of natural creation, and so has a female in general, among the animals too. Now, there comes a very interesting story. There is a Babylonian story of creation which antecedes the biblical story. And this story begins that the great goddess is a woman, the Tiamat, and the sons make a rebellion against her to dethrone her. And they try to find out who should be the leader. And they make a very interesting test. They had proposed a man by the name of Marduk, that's our Mordechai, but they make a test with him. They bring a piece of cloth, and they say, if he, by the power of his mouth, can produce this piece of cloth, and then by the power of his mouth can destroy it again, then he is worthy to defeat Tiamat, the great mother. And what does it mean? It means, of course, that he has acquired, not in a natural way, but by thought and word, to create. He has replaced the woman's mode of creation by the male mode of creation, which is purely intellectual, and which goes through ideas, words, and laws. And then the biblical story begins where the Babylonian story ends. God creates the world by the power of his mouth. He says there should be light, and there is light. We are so accustomed to the story that really we are not so aware of the absurdity that a male God should create the world. Only females used to do that. But he creates the world because they're you might say the Old Testament is already a song of victory, a song of victorious males over the defeat of the women. And they can now create the world purely by thought. And that's where we are. They have created a world which has led to the most extreme forms of technique which may destroy us, because they have lost the contact with nature. They have lost the contact of feeling. The brain becomes more and more, and especially in the last 200 years, separated from the heart, separated from feeling, separated from anything else. And in this process, they have suppressed and exploited the women.
Well, we will come back and we will look at the happier future instead of the more unhappy past in just a moment when we return to our discussion with Dr. Erich Fromm of his book, To Have or to Be. Here we are again, as promised, talking to Dr. Fromm. If it is true that these legends that we have been talking about indicate an unhappy direction, you suggest in your book that that direction was accelerated, at least in Europe, by Martin Luther,
Yeah.
who took the spiritualism of religious belief and set it to work as part of the exploitative process. In other words, it's been suggested by some that as a psychoanalyst may have an attachment from the patient to him which he can transfer, that Luther took the attachment of the love of God and transferred it to the Elector of Brandenburg. In other words, you should serve the state because by serving the state you serve God.
Yeah.
And therefore all that the state wishes in the way of making, of building, of having, has the blessing of religion.
Yes, and he has removed the feminine elements of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has in itself very markedly also feminine element. The all-loving Mother Church. The Pope, the priests, who are on the one hand, of course, male authorities, but at the other hand they are the all-forgiving, all-merciful mother figures. And that has made the Catholic Church so very impressive and so very important. While for Luther represents essentially the fatherly principle, the principle that of law and justice as a principle of mercy and love.
Well, you did say in your book that the great difference between the mother's love is uncritical. It exists in and of itself, whether
Yes.
you disappoint, whatever you do, it is constant. The father's love you equated with justice.
Yes, the
It
mother's
can be
love.
lost, it can be regained.
Yes, the mother's love is unconditional. A mother loves her child because it's her child. If mother loved their children, especially when they are very small, only if they are nice, if they are good, if they please them, most children would have died. Of course, I speak here speaking of mother, not of the ideal type as it runs through history. There are many mothers who are very unloving.
Oh, I should suspect that a great many psychoanalytic patients begin by saying,
Yes.
my mother didn't love me, and if she didn't, who will?
Yes. And of course, somewhat of a fetish is made of that too, because my mother didn't love me. Well, all right, so what?
Yes.
Very often one must also ask oneself as that goes, well, sometimes the mother doesn't love a child because the child is very unlovable.
Yes.
The child is not that innocent. The child has already its character when it is born. But that is another empirical matter. But throughout, let us say, in historical terms, motherly love was also the love which was biologically necessary, namely a love which didn't ask, you must deserve that I love you. While patriarchal male love had to do with the social structure. The father asked, who deserves to be the inheritor of my possessions? The boy who pleased him most, who was most like him. And so in patriarchal societies, and you see it very clear in the Old Testament, there's always a favorite son. He's not necessarily the oldest son. He is a son which the father likes best. And why does he like him best? Because he tries to be like the father, to be obedient, to be serviceable to the father. And the rebel is not liked by the father.
Hence the significance of the remark that Esau was hairy. He did not resemble the father.
Exactly.
Well, now, one of the early suggestions of a society of being rather than having was, at the end of the last century, the writer Edward Bellamy, in his book Looking Backward, suggested some of the things that seem part of your society, which is that everybody would get about the same amount of money. They would have existential having. You would have about the same economic circumstances
Yes.
for everyone, except that Bellamy, I suppose rather cynically, presumed that there must be some sort of competition. And you remember people competed for little ribbons. You could
Yes,
compete
yes,
when
yes.
you got a little ribbon to wear.
Yeah.
So that he did not wish to give up all of the having. You would have your
Yeah.
ribbons.
And Bellamy perhaps ignored somewhat the pleasure that can be had from working if it is not forced work, if it is not alienated, if work can give enormous pleasure. But a man must be participating in it. It must be something which is not forced upon him, where he can participate in the organization of the work, knows what he is doing. And of course, I think people who demand absolute equality are really basically people who suppress or repress their envy. Nobody should have the tiniest little bit more of me. This is really repressed envy. By having total equality, one avoids one's envy. But this is certainly not the aim, because people are not born equal anyway, and this leads to a destruction of all given individuals' gifts and talents. What matters is really each person can enjoy what he is doing, and work is not forced labor.
Well, one of the things which I do not pretend to understand the philosophy of Zen, and Japanese friends have assured me that if a great Japanese wise man doesn't understand it in a lifetime, I won't. But there is a concept that I can understand, which is a part of Zen philosophy, that the doing is all. It is not the result that is of interest. It is the doing. It is not that you're going to hit the target, you're shooting an arrow.
Exactly. That is really, in a way, the main thought of Zen. It's the main thought of Buddhism, too. And in fact, if you take Christianity, the Jewish religion, they have basically all the same aim. Don't covet, don't be greedy, don't hate, and don't have illusions. The great three sins of Buddhism are greed, destructiveness, and illusions. And there is no word about God. There is not anything one has to believe. Buddhism has, or the Buddha has, from his own experience, created an applied anthropology. His study of man has led him to the result to say that we have what we would call today a malaise. We feel ill. And that's what is expressed there as suffering. The word suffering is not quite what he meant. We live in a state of ill-being rather than well-being, because of our greed, because of our hate, because of our ignorance.
But at the same time that the Judeo-Christian scripture tells us not to covet, it also confusingly tells us the story of the talents and the servants who, one servant, you remember, goes out and makes a great deal of money with the talent, and it is that servant who simply buried it and then returned it who is rebuked.
That's quite true. In this respect, Buddhism is much more radical and much more uncompromising than a good deal. Well, even in the New Testament, there are, as historical studies have shown, various levels, from the oldest and most revolutionary levels and other levels where there are already compromises. But if you take the early church fathers, there is still a strong conviction against property, against accumulation, against having. And even if you take Thomas Aquinas, he made many more concessions than the early church fathers did. But nevertheless, he does not approve of having in the characterological sense. He was enough of a Christian. Now today, We pretend to be Christians, but we live up completely to the ideals, to pagan ideals. A strong hero who is most proud in the victory in killing his enemy. Well, that was a Greek and Teutonic hero. The Christian hero was a martyr.
The one who was crucified.
The one who was crucified, the one who was poor, the one who did not want possessions, and that's shown very clearly in the New Testament, and I write some about it in my book. Well, we are not really impressed by that.
Well, I was just thinking of the end of Ibsen's play John Gabriel Borkman, where the protagonist literally makes love to wealth. He reaches down, he talks about the ores under the earth, the metals. He says, I love you, unborn treasures, yearning for the light.
Yeah.
And the woman who was with him says, and in loving those things, you have lost the human love. Mm-hmm. You destroyed me and our love because you loved those things.
Yes.
And most people simply think of the play, I think, as just Borkman's bad luck. If he had managed to swing a bank loan, he could have had all that. But it is a terrible warning that you can by loving things, even if you have all the things, something is lost, which I think you also quoted in your book from the Bible, what profiteth a man to gain the whole world if he lose his own soul.
Yes. And it's a funny thing with us. We don't even love things anymore. We buy a car, and 2 years later we discard it already. In the 19th century, old was good. Old was beautiful. In the 20th century, the new is beautiful. Nothing
acquisition
but
is more important than the thing itself. It is the love of acquisition.
Exactly. And one is unfaithful, not only to men or women, but one is unfaithful to things, because as soon as they acquire them, one wants to throw them away.
One of the most interesting things about your book is the revelation through his early work that Karl Marx, far from being, as he is now interpreted, a high priest of mass materialism, was substantially a philosopher in the mode of being, and I want you to talk about that. How was it, in what stirring around in the many volumes of Marx did you discover him to be a philosopher on the side of being rather than having?
Well, Marx, one has to say first, there are few writers which have been so completely distorted, almost immediately, partly already by Engels, as Marx was. But of course then the communists and the social democrats have distorted him in exactly the opposite. Schumpeter, the great economist, once wrote, if somebody had discovered Europe at the time of the Inquisition and had, because that was called Christian, said the teachings of Christ were expressed in what the Inquisition did, this is about the same as concluding from the Soviet Union what Marx is. Marx was basically a religious person. He was in the embarrassing situation that he had to fight against the church. And so he didn't use these words. He was in fact allergic against all words which were used by people who want to establish religion and in a way by that delay real changes and progress in the social situation. But Marx himself said many times, if you are much, then you must have little. And if you have much, then you are little. This is one of the main topics. And in fact, the whole concept of Marx, as far as religion is concerned, has been very much misunderstood. There is a famous saying of Marx, opium is, religion is the opium for the people. Well, today one could say perhaps sex is the opium for the people. But what he meant, and if one reads this sentence in the context, is something quite different. He said religion fulfills needs of man, but it fulfills it in such a way that they are not really fulfilled, because we have a life, a social life, which is completely irreligious. In order to preserve some of the possibilities of fulfilling the legitimate religious need, we build a church. So the church here conserves some of the legitimate needs, but separate from real life. And Marx's idea was we must fulfill the real life of society with the religious values of truth, in which the development of man's functions, of man's faculties, is the supreme aim of all social society, of all social life, and not the state, and not production, and not consumption. And then we will have a society which is in itself the fulfillment of these religious values and does not need a religion apart anymore. You might say Marx's atheism was a religious atheism, in contrast to the bourgeois atheism, which said, to the materialistic atheism, which said, all that is nonsense. If we have our fun and our pleasure and eat and drink well and have everything else, that is life. That was the atheism of the 19th bourgeois.
Well, it is, of course, a word from psychoanalysis which irritates all who are not analysts, which says that gratification is different from joy. And what you get from the bourgeois atheism is gratification, which immediately requires another gratification.
Exactly. Exactly. Gratification is really a very modern concept. There was, with the exception of Aristippus, in the classic philosophy, nobody who was in favor of gratification as a purpose of life. But what they meant by pleasure was the fulfillment, a very special pleasure, namely fulfillment of man's wish for knowledge, of contemplation, or at least of not suffering. And the Freudians have to a large extent taken over the very modern bourgeois concept that the meaning of life and the aim of life is gratification of all senses, and that people suffered from inhibitions of that. Well, 50 years ago they said people were sick because they had suppressed sex. Mm-hmm. Today you might say, if anything, they are sick because sex is the only thing they have got, and they confuse completely sex with intimacy. They have nothing to do with each other. People remain, sexual connections, two people remain as strange from each other, and on the other hand, two people may look at each other and may even touch the arm of the other, and there might be a tremendous tenderness and intimacy in this little act. But sex itself doesn't bring about intimacy at all.
Well, now, as you point out in your book, this having or being is not a political thing of left and right, as Marx is speaking in part for being in his real life. So you pointed out that Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative Prime Minister of England, said somewhat the same thing. He had, as people on the other side may, and those who have struggled through his peculiar novel Sybil or The Two Nations, remember that there is a kind of an ideal of just enough production, happy workers, very different from what any laissez-faire capitalist would have had in mind.
Yes. In fact, I think, glad you mentioned this, I think the camps are completely wrongly organized. There are many people who are conservatives because they really hang on to the deep values of our Western culture and believe or are persuaded that the conservative parties who speak that way will in fact also have a policy which tends to realize this. And there are many liberals and leftists who have the basic same values and express them in political terms, maybe of socialism or some other ideology. But these two camps are basically very related because they have the same human aims. While on the other hand, there are many conservatives who are just using conservative formula for the naked exploitation of others, and many leftists who basically are not different, who basically also believe the strongly authoritarian society is the best way to promote happiness for all people. What they really promote, let us say the communists, is that all men should be bourgeois. That was really the aim of communists and the aim of the Social Democrats, while Marx really felt we need a new man.
Might we be better without so many absolutes? I remember E.M. Forster, that skeptical old man, said, I don't really believe in belief.
Yes, well, I think we would be better. For instance, today all these political words, like socialism or the word revolution, are so misused and have become thereby so meaningless, that I believe it would be better if we could come to really expressing more adequately, what do I stand for? A great Frenchman, Abbé Pierre, once said, there's only one difference between men, those who care and those who don't care. And that, I think, is perhaps a much more adequate way of describing two camps than what we do today with our political slogans.
But were we to proceed not by belief, which does not allow for much examination, but by a kind of healthy skepticism, perhaps get back to Earl Russell's enlightened self-interest, we might simply see by an examination of our world and how many people live on it, that the day when having can be a way of life for everyone is over. It must be. There are just too many of us.
Well,
pragmatically.
I think it is over, and the question for us is either to return to a social organization which furthers the mode of being, not in a sense that all people become saints, but that the whole society is filled with a spirit that encourages its being, or we'll just destroy ourselves by our greediness, by the terrific greediness of everybody, which goes so far that what we do is to leave our grandchildren a poisoned world, weapons which will sooner or later to lead to the destruction of the world, and we think only of ourselves for the moment, of the success of a politician for the moment, with no concern, even for our own, for the future generations of our own.
Well, now, one of the things that you spoke of that I think ought to be mentioned is that for many people now, knowledge even is simply a property. You call it the property knowledge. You go to a school, you hear what they say, you give it back to them, and that knowledge constitutes your license to a job with more money.
Yes.
Even knowledge should be examined not simply in terms of what it will do for you, but in terms of what it is.
In points of what is?
Just what knowledge is rather than what knowledge will lead to. There are advertisements in newspapers say a college degree is worth $250,000.
Exactly. Knowledge has become a piece of property, and it is sold, really.
Mm-hmm. Very high prices lately, too.
Yes, and the emphasis is also it is not difficult. Our slogan is no effort. And this is fantastic. One achieves something without effort but with high results. Well, nothing of importance is achieved without effort, without great effort. And we beg our young people to have knowledge without making great efforts. That is because then they have got something and they can be used for industry, and their real intelligence and capacity for knowing is reduced to a minimum.
Well, one thing we haven't got into and we won't get into, I urge people to go and find out about it for themselves. Toward the end of To Have or To Be, Dr. Fromm has a number of suggestions as to how we may not easily but sensibly move from the mode of having to the mode of being. Go out and get the book and find out how and begin to work your way toward it. It may be achieved by your grandchildren if we're fortunate. In the meantime, I thank Dr. Erich Fromm, the author of To Have or To Be, for being with us today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Haywood Hale Broun. Woody will be back next time with more interesting guests. The Haywood Hale Broun Show is brought to you by Prevention, the magazine of better health. Produced by Cinema Sound Limited, New York.